Oh, okay, excellent. No, I'm old. I just, yeah, I shaved this morning, so maybe that's why. Yes, ma'am. Yes. No, so Greg Phillips, I was supposed to do record an interview with him at, I believe it was 11 Eastern Standard Time, and unfortunately, we had a lot of feedback issues with StreamYard, so we postponed. Right after this interview, I'm going to do one with him. It looks like, and so I'll have to bump the other one that I had scheduled for two. Hmm. Okay. Yep. Oh yes. Amen. I'm in Northern Virginia. Hmm. Yeah, I try to keep it professional, cordial, respectful, right? Well, maybe she knows who I am now. Who knows? After a few million views, I'm sure maybe someone looked me up. Hmm. I have not focused any of my attention, unfortunately, on that, so I would not be an expert. I wouldn't even be close to being a one thousandth of an expert on that particular subject. So it'd waste your audience's time. Well, thank you. Thanks, Eileen, for having me. Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm sure your viewers and listeners know the term deep state. It reflects the corrupt actors within our, uh, at this point, within not only our executive branch, which is the primarily target of my rooting out corruption, but also all three branches of the federal government, as well as institutions at the state and local levels. But I think the biggest tyrannical overreach currently occurring within the deep state is coming from the executive federal branch, and that's where my focus is. Now, the term maraud or marauding, I guess, I don't know, I thought many people knew what that term is, but as I'm traveling the country, many people are not familiar with that term. And I'd like to equate it to this. Everyone knows what a pirate is. Everybody knows what a pirate does to a ship if it's a successful pirate. And they do what's known as going onto the ship, boarding it, and then conducting the looting process so that they secure all of the treasure and booty from that ship. Now, instead of thinking of a ship, think of the ship being essentially the location where the deep state is located, and the booty that we're trying to seek to plunder is known as freedom. So when you take deep state and the process of plundering and securing and pillaging for the treasure and booty, that verb is called maraud, right? To maraud, or the gerund is marauding. So if you take an individual and he wants to do the same what a pirate does to a ship, but to the deep state, I think the most appropriate term in order to regain our freedoms that this lawless ship, if you will, the deep state, has pillaged from us, the only way to secure it back properly is to do what's known as deep state marauding. And after I retired, I basically took on the nom de guerre, if you will, or the fighting term, or the whatever you want to call it, as the deep state marauder. And some people like to call me America's law offensive coordinator, but I think it's more fitting to say deep state marauder. And I would like to enlist as many American patriots into this new profession as much as I can, and hopefully you can help with that process, and you can join me in becoming a fellow deep state marauder. I am. I spent a quarter of a century, which equates to a little over 10% of our nation's history, that I've served in our military, as a both in the Department of Defense, the United States Army, in various capacities, whether it's in the special operations or intelligence communities, countering ISIS, Taliban, MS-13, Russian aggression, in 5 different languages across 5 continents. Yeah, and when I didn't do any active service during that period of time, I picked up a law degree and focused on national security and personnel security law. So, kind of security clearance and some tangential constitutional law activity. I like to say currently I'm involved in very high risk, unconventional, constitutional legal strategy. Oh, yeah, I absolutely have their number. Yep, I have their number, and I'll be shutting them up and shutting them down. Yeah, I think I pronounce it slightly differently. I know people pronounce things differently. My way of pronouncing what happened in 2020 is the illegally conducted and then subsequently illegally certified 2020 federal presidential and vice presidential election. And then that includes, as part of that umbrella, it includes what's pronounced as the Fedsurrection. Some people pronounce it the Nancy erection, meaning Nancy Pelosi was the one that spearheaded a parliamentary coup that secured the Uniparty's final victory, at least temporarily, in pushing out the only individual and movement that could expose, prosecute, try, what is it called? try, convict, and fry the individuals that were involved in the initial sin and transgression as it applies to this phase of our country's history, which was the DOJ and the national security states illegal and defrauding of the FISA court in order to gain the necessary leverage to protect their own interests. And the way they did that was to create the necessary leverage to slow roll their exposure during President Trump's first term. Right. So a brief, in a couple of sentences, a brief history on the FISA court. So if you recall back in 1973, a couple of things really happened that should help frame what's going on today. So 50 years ago, you had a junior senator from Delaware was elected for the first time. And today he's sitting as the Chinese Communist Party's ambassador to the US, squatting and defiling our White House. And some people pronounce his name as Joseph Robinette Biden. I think it's more fitting to pronounce his last name Zhiden, as he is essentially a lackey or an agent of China at this point, based on his and his family's foreign dealings with China, Ukraine, Romania, the former mayor of Moscow's wife, also bringing in millions of dollars into the Biden criminal syndicate. So 1973 kicks off. He then later on into the later 70s becomes a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that was the committee, along with the House Judiciary Committee, that created the mechanism for the FBI to not be able to just haphazardly, willy-nilly, on their own volition, spy on American citizens, particularly spy on American citizen political opponents that were challenging the established order. Think of the political threats to the established order back in those times in the 60s and later into 70s. We're thinking of the Kennedy brothers. We're thinking of Martin Luther King Jr. So we saw that the FBI was involved, and more than likely, based on open source reporting through COINTELPRO programs, to go ahead and up to and including assassinate their political targets, right? No, I would say that the corruption the FBI started in 1908 when it was created as the Bureau of Investigation. Okay, and then later when it was renamed to the FBI, I think other people may pronounce it incorrectly as the FBI. But yeah, that organization essentially, when J. Edgar Hoover took over when he was in his late 20s and lasted in that position for approximately 48 years, similar to the Chinese Communist Party ambassador currently squatting in the White House, spending 5 decades in that position. When you're in a position such as that with a lot of leverage and the ability to dig dirt on individuals, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so that was the clearest indication within our government system of an individual of massive amounts of power accumulated, because he outlasted multiple presidents, right? Multiple generations of presidencies. And so that culture, please. Correct. I mean, since its inception, and I just want to give a little bit of background to tee up what's going on today. So we're looking at 48 years. We have J. Edgar Hoover, and at his apogee or his apex of power and corruption is when these political assassinations were being conducted, right? And so fast forward, this sort of culture. I mean, we're only into the 70s. That culture was essentially created the maximum weaponization by the FBI and the government against its own citizens. And that's when there was a shift, slightly at least, within our American political conversation where there was a demand within Congress to create a mechanism that would at least provide a little bit of a mitigating check on that lawlessness by creating what's known as the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, so that there would be a mechanism so that the FBI would have to approach another branch of government, the judiciary, to request permission to spy on its political opponents. Now, some people may argue, say, "Oh, no, that statute wasn't created to legally spy on political opponents. It's focused on, if you read the statute, the whole purpose of it is in order to allow a mechanism for the FBI to spy on American citizens that have foreign connections that create a national security threat and concern, whether it's through international terrorism connections or international foreign intelligence services, right? Which, it sells well and it makes sense. The statute was enacted in 1978. Now, one key thing to note, this is what people need to consider when you're looking into the deep state. The most important thing to do is who is in what position, what discretionary authority they have based on statute, and what relationships created them to be in that position. That's how I look at things. And so when you look at 1978 and you do the deep dive and you start to think, well, who was involved in creating the statute? Well, one key individual that's still in place today is Joseph Robinette Gieden, the failed senator and then subsequently failed vice president and now failed Chinese Communist Party ambassador. He was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, essentially putting that statute together. Okay, I'm not making any assumptions. I'm just stating that that was what occurred. There's maybe some smoke there that needs to be looked into further, but as a frame of reference, that's something to keep in mind. The next thing that I'd like to add to this discussion is that the statute sets forth that those members of the FISA court, there were originally 7 members of the FISA court, judges that were already federal judges, would then be appointed to sit on the FISA court to make that determination whether or not the FBI's request to spy on someone was legitimate to then grant a warrant. Remember, the defendant or the target of that FISA, they cannot be represented by themselves, pro se, or via an attorney in order to defend their name. This is done between the judiciary and the executive branches, FBI, okay, and DOJ. So the executive and judiciary. So the next question is, who is appointed to be a judge on the FISA court? Well, the statute lays out that it's the Supreme Court Chief Justice that is the one individual that appoints FISA court judges. So then let's step this through. So the history of the FISA court has been in place since 78. Originally, there were 7 members. So then who appointed those original 7 members? Well, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time? I think it was Earl Warren, right? And who appointed Earl Warren? It was a guy by the name of Nixon. Nixon, a Republican, right? And so you could assume that the networks of the Warrens of the world on who he's going to appoint are probably those individuals that have an R by their political affiliation, right? Let's fast forward to the next Chief Justice that then came into play. It was William Rehnquist. It's not a lifetime position. So it's a lifetime appointment to be a federal judge, but you have to be a federal judge first to be appointed as an additional duty as a FISA court judge to be able to listen in and grant. That is for a term of 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, 7 or 9 years. So then, and it's on a rotating basis. And so nowadays it's appointed, there's a staggering term, kind of like the Senate. You have a third, a third, a third. Well, the FISA judges are appointed in a manner where a portion is appointed every 2 years. Now, fast forward to William Rehnquist, which was appointed by Ronald Reagan, right? And then you have, after that, Chief Justice John Roberts is the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was appointed in 2005. So using that staggered approach, you can pretty much take it to the bank that by 2012, 7 years after Chief Justice Roberts was appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by George W. Bush, Chief Justice John Roberts had appointed every single FISA court judge that sits on that bench since 2012. Now, would it be a strong assumption to say that he pretty much owns the conversation, if he really wanted to, on who gets, if they want to go after a political target? Chief Justice John Roberts kind of runs the show, doesn't he? I'm not stating that for fact. I'm just saying, would it be a logical assumption to make that the person that appointed Chief Justice John Roberts, meaning the Bush Cheney syndicate, they have some influence over Chief Justice John Roberts since they appointed him? And then wouldn't it be an assumption to make, a strong one, I think, that Chief Justice John Roberts, having appointed every single FISA court judge, that there's some sort of loyalties back to Chief Justice John Roberts? Would that be a fair assumption? I'm not making any facts. So then by 2012, and oh, by the way, before 2012 rolls around, this is a keynote that I always like to make in my interviews, is that in 2001, we had 9/11, and then we had the Patriot Act passed, right? In 2002. And what happened with that Patriot Act? Two key points that I'd like to make. Number one, the FISA court judges went from 7 judges to 11. So the FISA court had expanded at that point, thus creating almost a 50% increased throughput on who could be, targeted for spying by the FBI with other U.S. government resources to be able to conduct a wiretap, etc., right, with the technology that the government had, lawfully based on a FISA warrant issued by a FISA court judge that John Roberts had appointed. It didn't matter which FISA court judge you went to. All of them were, I argue, loyal to Chief Justice John Roberts, and by extension, loyal to, in the event that they wanted to interject themselves, the Bush-Cheney syndicate. Okay? Now that's the Article 3 branch of government as it applies to our national security ecosystem. You also have the Article 2, that's the FISA court. Article 2 component, which is the executive branch, we mentioned, is the DOJ's National Security Division, FBI's National Security Branch, right? And so, let's fast forward to 2012. We talked about defrauding the FISA court. So in 2016, in July, late July 2016, the Department of Justice decided to go ahead and create a schematic with the FBI to go ahead and request and apply for a FISA application to the FISA court. Now, what is required for the FBI ex parte to present its case to the FISA court to say, hey, you need to trust us and believe that you need to give us the authority to spy on an American citizen? Well, that document and that binder, if you will, of information is known as a Woods file. And the process is called the Woods procedure, meaning they have to compile enough information for reasonable suspicion that the individual that they're targeting has connectivity with a foreign intelligence service or a foreign terrorist organization in order to be able to use the methods at the disposal to the tools, I should say, available in order to conduct the necessary FISA wiretap on an American citizen. Okay? And that American citizen was an individual by the name of, before I go into his name, a retired naval officer who was traveling and working as a consultant in oil and gas. One of his clients, or I should say, his activity, business activity, included trips to Russia, of which he had coordinated with the Central Intelligence Agency and basically told them and debriefed his activity when he went to Russia so that it would provide increased national security capability for our United States to improve our national security ability and giving insight on what was going on in Russia. So everything he was doing was on the up and up. However, and the person that I'm mentioning is a guy by the name of Carter Page. Carter Page was an advisor, one of the early advisors on candidate Donald Trump's presidential campaign. And so the deep state, if you will, and I'm going to name some names once we go through here. The deep state decided they needed a mechanism of leverage and insight into a campaign of a presidential campaign that was not to this point leveraged by either political party. Because what? How did the president gain his wealth? It wasn't through the political mechanism. It wasn't through any sort of government stuff. I mean, real estate, right? Media, etc. So I argue that they had to create, they being both sides of the aisle, both the China First Republicans and the China First Democrats, they had to create the necessary frame to create the leverage necessary to then go ahead and target the individual president or candidate Trump. Okay. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. Carter Page, so they essentially looked through everybody in the Trump camp and decided those individuals that had already international dealings, they were going to try to entrap and create the necessary mechanism to justify and make it look like it was a lawful FISA request to then go ahead and conduct the spying on a particular member of the Trump campaign. The reason I argue that they chose Carter Page is because he had those dealings. But then when they found out that he was basically briefing the CIA on his activities there, the FBI reached out to the CIA and asked, and by the way, the individual at the FBI that did this was a guy by the name of Kevin Kleinsmith, an attorney. And he asked the CIA, hey, is Carter Page I'm not sure exactly the term they use, an asset or a reporting agent on his activities in Russia? And the individual at the CIA responded with, why, yes. Our files show that, yes, he's up on the up and up, and he's working on behalf of the United States. There's nothing to see here, nothing nefarious. And guess what Kevin Kleinsmith did with that email? He changed yes to a no, and that no in that email was used in the original FISA Woods file in order to obtain the original FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page. And Kevin Kleinsmith pled guilty that that's what he did. And right. Right, because he had former members of the FBI, senior officials, that requested of the same judge, I believe that was the judge in persecuting General Flynn, guy by the name of Emmett Sullivan, that said, you know what? Nothing to see here. We have a two-tiered justice system. and he's going, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that two-tiered justice system, the bifurcation of justice, is expanded even further. Well, it's funny you ask about that. He happens to be the judge that is going. He's a judge emeritus, I believe. He's still on the bench, and he's going to be the one taking the case for a guy by the name of John Sullivan. I believe no relation exists, and John Sullivan happens to be the inner breach team leader on January 6th, a known Antifa BLM guy. And I guess we'll eventually get to that point, but as a quick deviation and aside, that trial is slated for October of 2023. And John Sullivan, remember the guy that recorded Ashley Babbitt being murdered by Lieutenant now supposedly promoted to Captain Michael Byrd for his raw execution of an American citizen inside the Capitol, the first time in American history. Anyway, that John Sullivan that recorded that and was the inner breach team leader that breached the Capitol that day, he's out in Ukraine recording and doing some content creation as it applies to the Uniparty's role in the Ukraine. So he's out there free, and they'll probably just keep postponing his trial until everybody forgets about it so that they can then ultimately dismiss that so that he's not proven to be the uh, inner breach team leader on that Fedsurrection coup. Okay. There's a lot there. I mean, I can answer each one of those. Probably require a 20 to 30 minute response, but overall, I'm going to say this, that in order to address the massive corruption, just to close off on the last thing that I said, the 2016 spying and 2017 spying on Carter Page that was unlawful and defrauded the FISA court. At a minimum, it was just the defrauding of the FISA court. I would say, based on the context of Chief Justice Roberts appointing the entire FISA court, I would have to. I mean, my strong assumption, I assess that it was probably more than that in the sense that the FISA court judges probably knew and probably helped facilitate that spying to occur so that the Uniparty would have insight into the Trump campaign to be able to try to identify something in there to smear him in the event that they won and secure the nomination so that they would have that hanging over him and leverage so that they could pull a 25th Amendment option and later essentially use that to kick him out of office for whatever reason. And that's still playing out today, right? The reason why they're escalating against Trump with these indictments and everything else, it's while everybody claims it's the Democrats and only the Democrats that are involved in this, as I laid out to you, at the very least within the Article 3 branch of government, you can't blame it only on Democrats because, at a minimum, due to negligence in allowing the spying to occur, I mean, these are all Republicans, right? The entire judicial ecosystem. And then Jim Comey, uh, Republican, right? Robert Mueller, appointed by Republicans. So it's disingenuous to then, even to include President Trump, to only lay blame on the Democrats within the DOJ and the quote Biden DOJ. This is not a Biden DOJ. This is a Obama, Biden, Bush, Cheney DOJ. And to say that it's a Trump DOJ when he was the president, it's somewhat disingenuous because most of the people in those senior positions are loyal to the Mitch McConnells of the world if they're a judge, because at the end of the day, or a Lindsey Graham loyalist, because in order to become a judge, even though Trump appointed 300 of them, you have to first go through the Senate Judiciary Committee, the chairman Lindsey Graham. You have to go through the Senate Majority Leader, which is at the time was Mitch McConnell, before it even gets to being kind of considered by President Trump. And then you also have to go through the vice president, which used to sit on the judiciary in the House, Mikey Pence. So those three individuals have the leverage of creating a DOJ and a DHS and an FBI of their liking, especially the judges and the FISA court judges. So their loyalties are not with the America First movement. It's more in line with, like I said, the Mitch McConnells, the Paul Ryans, the Bush, the Cheneys, the Lindsey Grahams, and the Mike Pences of the world. Now, the question is, where does Kevin McCarthy stand or sit or lay or kneel as it applies to this, right? Well, we saw in the speakers fight that we have a little bit of, we have a method to push back against the Kevin McCarthy captured kind of, I call them China First Republicans and China First Democrats, right? They're all China First. And then there's about 40 in the Congress that are America First members of Congress. And I would say maybe you have maximum 4 or 5 senators that are America First, barely within the Senate. So what's our solution, you're asking, right? Like, how do we claw ourselves out of this corruption that's only been escalating and that resulted in a Fedsurrection coup on January 6th? And then they're going after those that are exposing their Fedsurrection coup going back to 2016, whether it's swatting of, Bannon, whether it's contempt charges on Navarro. I think the method is to apply the necessary maximal political pressure on Kevin McCarthy to either do what he needs to do, I'm going to lay it out, or vacate him and put somebody in his place that will actually conduct a reset body check of the lawless executive branch and the previous legislative branch. So here's what he needs to do. Number one, I articulated this yesterday on One American News. Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House. Remember, it was the previous Speaker in the 117th Congress that was the one that laid down criminal referrals on Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro. Why can't a Speaker of the House, the same position constitutionally, go ahead and pull back those criminal referrals, or even invite Navarro and Steve Bannon to testify for, 8 seconds, basically thus fulfilling the requirements of the subpoena that was laid on them that they said that they wouldn't respond to because of presidential, what's the term? Immunity, right? And so Kevin McCarthy, if he doesn't do that, then you know where he stands. If Kevin McCarthy doesn't use his platform and megaphone to go ahead and release the 44,000 hours of CCTV footage of January 6th, then the entire country needs to see that he is complicit in the J6 Fedsurrection coup. See, all roads lead to the Fedsurrection coup on January 6th. Kevin McCarthy is complicit in not allowing a quorum to take place on January 6th, along with Mike Pence. They refused, along with Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell. Those 5 individuals agreed, along with the Senate and House parliamentarians, along with the General Counsel, the Speaker, and the Majority Leader, and the U.S. Capitol Police General Counsel. All of those people were involved in facilitating the unlawful entry and subsequent parliamentary coup. The only way that they get out of this and avoid facing the wrath of the American people, which is going to come, mark my words, I personally guarantee that the wrath of the American people will come down on all of these scum. And the only way that they survive is to start to come clean. That is the only way that they're going to survive this politically. And the way that I'm giving my personal guarantee. And if people want to expedite that, then they need to join me in this process. If they want this process to be slow and delayed, then guess what? And if you're going to sit on the sidelines and complain and say it's not going to happen, then guess what? It forces me to drag you along with me, and that slows me down. Okay? So, if you want to not slow things down, then at a minimum, sit and watch. If you want to expedite it, then jump in and start participating. Here's what we need to do. Number one, when we release the 44,000 hours of footage by creating the necessary leverage on the U.S. Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger and the U.S. Capitol Police Chief Tad DeBias, we're going to prove to the entire world, because Tucker is going to amplify this, Joe Rogan is going to amplify this, and Elon Musk is going to amplify the following. The footage that was sent over to the DOJ, along with the criminal referrals written, were also included manipulated and doctored impact statements of U.S. Capitol Police officers, so that the conviction rate that the DOJ was, the conviction rate against the J6 defendants would be 100%. And the U.S. Capitol Police has been withholding all exculpatory information and proof that they were involved in facilitating that unlawful breach into the Capitol. And the individuals that were involved primarily in the breach on that day, through inaction, through ensuring that there was no protection of the Capitol so that people would come in and there was a documented insurrection, are the following: Nancy Pelosi, her daughter Alexandra, who was on the inside documenting this, her son-in-law Michael Pelosi Voss on the outside, who was documenting this, and almost certainly coordinating the breach with Ray Epps on the outside for the outer breach, the inner breach team leader John Sullivan, and then the warlord that was the insider facilitating all of this at the U.S. Capitol Police was a lady by the name of Yogananda Pittman, who was head of Intel and Interagency Coordination Division at U.S. Capitol Police. And she was elevated on January 8th to be the Capitol Police Chief from January 8th until July 23rd. And so anybody that was raided or arrested from January 8th until July 23rd of 2021, it was because of Yogananda Pittman's doctored and manipulated and curated CCTV footage, and she used her position to leverage and manipulated U.S. Capitol Police officers that were in the vicinity of J6 defendant, so that J6, or so that U.S. Capitol Police officer would write up a impact statement that wasn't commensurate with truth and reality, but they were forced and coerced into that in order to keep their job and not get fired. And then in some instances were promoted depending on their impact statement, and were given awards for such. Well, how do I know this? Whistleblowers. Whistleblowers that aren't insiders. And if you don't believe me, please follow the following two Twitter accounts. Chief Sund, the former Capitol Police Chief, and then, what is it? Tarek Johnson, former U.S. Capitol Police officer, lieutenant, that was there that day, and a lot of people remember him as the black gentleman who was wearing the MAGA hat in order to de-escalate the situation. Absolutely brilliant and genius of him to do that, and he did do that. He de-escalated the situation. Unfortunately, Yogananda Pittman stopped him from timely evacuating the house, which, had he done it at the time that he requested, or even a few minutes later, there would have been no Ashley Babbitt murder by Lieutenant Michael Byrd. There would have been no, bottom line, it would have slowed down the Fedsurrection from taking place. And I think that the objections would have been heard, and potentially Kevin McCarthy and Mike Pence would have decided on, this is, by the way, I presented this to Kevin McCarthy and Mike Pence's chief of staff. I said, on January 6th, if Kevin McCarthy decides to vote one state, one vote when they go and break out in the objections, according to the 12th Amendment's contingent election frame, rather than the Pelosi one person, one vote in the House, then you could see easily that the Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada electors would be objected to, and thus triggering an overall contingent election, thus a re-election had everyone voted by, by party. Unfortunately, because my Twitter was so visible through multiple retweets by Trump, I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi and her staff knew that that could take place, and thus they had to create this Fedsurrection. I argue, hindsight being 2020, talking to so many people, I believe that I am singularly qualified to understand what occurred in the run up to January 6th and expose what they did on January 6th through my research over the last 2 years, because of my interactions with the key individuals that were involved in making the necessary decisions that would have resulted in a re-election. And because of that, Pelosi had to spring into action, the uniparty, whatever you want to call it, to be able to deny that from occurring. And now, since then, they've been covering up and covering up. So, bottom line, Kevin McCarthy needs to squirm maximally. So do the current Capitol Police Chief and the General Counsel. And once we release the footage, it's game over. And I think the best ally in this process for us is Congressman Barry Loudermilk from Georgia, because he sits on the subcommittee known as the Subcommittee on Oversight, which is part of the overall committee known as House Administration. And that committee and subcommittee has oversight over the Capitol Police Board. So if we continue to demand Barry Loudermilk, Congressman from Georgia, to go ahead and release the transcripts of his interview with Yogananda Pittman, release the 7 hours he did with her, release the transcripts of his investigation and discussion with the General Counsel Tad Tobias and Thomas Manger, the Capitol Police Chief, I think America is going to finally see firsthand my investigation in the court of public opinion that will prove the entire J6 narrative is wholeheartedly false, and it was literally a coup, and thus all J6 criminal defendant nonviolent need to be exonerated, reinstated, reconstituted, and that includes the criminal indictments, especially the one in DC against President Trump. So that's just a superficial insight into the deep state. Because I mean, I have every single one of them listed by name, date, location, transgression, and I publish it on my Substack if you want more details. It's ivanraiklin.substack.com. God bless you. Thank you. All right, folks, another interview in the books. So, for those that are listening in on some of these other platforms, I see you can only hear my side. I got it. I'm trying to figure out a way where I can restream and conduct interviews. Haven't figured that out yet, so bear with me. But that's all I have for now. And if you want to support my work, go ahead and follow and subscribe to my Substack, ivanraiklin.substack.com. Additionally, let me see if I can add something here. You can follow me here on Telegram, X, Getter, Locals, Rumble, QUX, Cloud Hub, Truth, Gab, and Substack. And if you want to have me come speak at your event, whether it's a Patriot event, local county GOP event, election integrity event, deep state marauding event, just as an educational piece to give insight on who the scumbags are within our constitutional framework, please go ahead and send an email to info@raiklin.com with date, time, location, and event type, whether you want to in person or virtual, as well as if you want to have me on your show, on your podcast, please go ahead and send a request, info@raiklin.com. And in a few minutes, I will be recording looks like the next podcast, and that's going to be with Greg Phillips of True the Vote. So on that note, a couple other things I want to mention. If you want some insider, behind the scenes premium content, which I only post on my X premium, go ahead and subscribe. And it's basically some of the interactions that I'm having behind the scenes at different events, different conferences, speaking engagements, as well as in Congress, and at sometimes some insight that I don't want the broader uh, audience, meaning those that are from the radical domestic terrorist left, knowing unless they support my work. I post that up on my X. Subscribed. Let me see what else we got here. That's about it, folks. I think that's about it. Those are my plugs for the day. If you want to continue, if you don't want to subscribe to my Substack, I'm going to create a new banner. Let's do that. I don't know if I can do that here. Yeah, create a new banner. If you want to support my work without subscribing to my Substack, you can go to Give, Send, Go. Give, Send, Go. People ask me to put this out. .com. I'm putting it in right now. And this supports my research and investigative work into the deep state so that I can expose not only the Fedsurrection coup further, which it looks like we're very close, but other scumbags. And I think it's going to start supporting my, let me see here. There you go. It's going to start supporting my other investigations, which I think at this point, I'm pretty soon going to be transitioning into investigating every single individual at the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, because it appears as though they're really not doing their constitutional duty, which is investigating tax fraud of the Biden criminal syndicate. And instead, they're providing top cover. So I think it's now past time to identify each individual within the IRS that's providing cover for the Biden criminal syndicate. And we're going to do a nice little deep dive into their finances, meaning we're going to identify the individuals, we're going to identify their family members, friends, where they live, what sources of revenue and whatnot that they're receiving, who they're providing support to politically based on their FEC reporting. We're just going to do a nice deep dive, open source investigation into each individual, starting off with each individual that has been providing top cover for the Biden criminal syndicate at the IRS. So stay tuned. Another investigative line of effort for me, and I suspect it's going to get pretty interesting because so far I have a lot of, let's just say, dirt on members of our lawless and illegitimate executive branch, amidst DOD, DOJ, DHS, the 117th Congress leadership. And now I'm just going to venture out and start looking into the IRS. So please support. GiveSendToGo.com/Raiklin. Out.